One of the major topics we discuss on this channel is international tax optimization. I've done a video previously, we can link to it above, regarding why it is, in my opinion, the most ethical thing you can possibly do to pay the lowest legal amount of tax. And clearly, a large part of our expertise is as global tax experts, and so that's one of the things we're always working on. However, we had a comment from one of our viewers a while ago stating that the typically better countries to live in, the higher quality of life, come from higher tax rates. And so there's a question of, are you kind of damaging your people's ability to have a good life by lowering your taxes? And in the macro, it should be better to have higher taxes because it would be better to end up with a better quality of life for the general people. I'm going to discuss that with you now from a first principles standpoint. We're going to look at some evidence in terms of the tax rates of different countries around the world. Most people kind of live in a bubble and they aren't aware of what's going on in a lot of places. So I'm going to shed some light on it, and we're going to clear up that question right now. Before we do, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button, hit the all notification bell. Thank you for being here. Welcome. I am Lord Michael from Offshore Citizen, and we help you with global relocation, getting residencies, citizenships, forming companies, opening bank accounts, determining the best global strategy for you if you're interested in having a business that operates in multiple countries, or you want to be globally mobile yourself. If those things are interesting to you, please reach out to us. You can book a call with me, calendly.com/Michael-Rosmer. There's a link in the description below, or send a message through offshorecitizen.net. All right, so let's just start by a famous quote from Winston Churchill, of all people, which stated that a nation trying to tax itself into prosperity is akin to a man standing in a bucket and trying to raise himself by the handle. I think that's probably the starting point that I would view as the root for all of this. Fundamentally, there was a great line from the famous economist Thomas Sowell in the book Wealth, Poverty, and Politics, where he mentioned that poverty does not need to be explained, it is wealth that needs to be explained. In other words, our default state is poverty. We are born as a species into essentially starvation. We're hunter and gatherers. Everything that we have beyond that, we had to build. In other words, the default you need to explain is not wealth, it's not poverty. You don't need to explain why are people poor. You need to explain why they're rich. And the fundamental driver behind this actually is productivity. Okay? In other words, if people don't produce stuff, there is no stuff, and the people who produce more stuff tend to have more stuff, as opposed to, allocation. Now, there is something to be said that there are people who produce things and then have it extracted from them. That's a whole other conversation. We'll talk about it in a second. But at the basic level, a society is successful really to the extent that it is productive. And let's look at some simple evidence of this. So the thesis that was put forward by the person in the comments some time back was, as I said, places that have better quality of life are higher tax, places that have lower quality of life are lower tax. He would probably be surprised to realize that the highest tax rates in the world are actually in Africa. And there's not a lot of people who would argue that the best quality of life is in Africa. There's a general reason why we help people move all over the world, and there's very little interest in moving to Africa, quite the opposite. So Ivory Coast in particular, Senegal, Zimbabwe, places like this tend to have very high taxes. And so I think what happens is people get a distorted view by operating within a bubble. And so let's just take Europe, for example. You could say, all right, well, the quality of life is probably higher in Denmark, Sweden, etc., than it is in Bulgaria and Romania, and therefore we can correlate that the taxes are higher in Sweden and Denmark than they are in Bulgaria and Romania, and therefore this is the determining factor. But this is the false analysis that comes from either confusing correlation for causation and looking at an insufficient sample size. So I'm going to go through with you some of the places that are low tax that have high quality of life, and especially relative to their peers. And we'll talk about some places which are high tax, which are low quality of life, and then we'll do the opposite to be totally fair. So let's just start with low tax places with high quality of life. I'm here in Dubai at the moment. Quality of life is extraordinarily high in Dubai. And they have no personal taxes, no corporate taxes, 5% VAT. So pretty good. For local citizens, it's very good. Now, what you may say is, well, there's all these people who are brought in as service staff and their quality of life is quite low. That's probably a fair criticism. However, it's worth noting that they're typically paid more than they would be in their home country, and their quality of life, in some respects, may be a meaningful improvement from their home country. So it's hard to kind of generalize there. I would point out in general, as we go through some of these places, that tax systems are complex. So our expertise here, or a big part of our expertise, is international tax optimization. And so it bothers me a little bit to try and apply a headline rate to some place and say, is it high tax or is it low tax? Because there's lots of nuances. There are various different loopholes that might exist in certain cases. There might be variance within the country. For example, if you're talking about Switzerland, the federal rate is quite low. The cantonal rates can bring it moderately high, depending on the canton. And so, it varies. That's just one example. It's true all across the board. But just for the sake of this conversation, we're going to focus on simplifying the tax systems a little bit. So UAE, high quality of life, low tax. And in fact, this is true broadly across some of the Middle Eastern countries, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, etc., Saudi Arabia, to some extent you could say. Again, depends on who you are in some of these places, obviously, but there's definitely some pretty high quality of life for a bunch of people. Actually, there's a really interesting video from NAS Daily recently on the UAE passport and what all things people get as a UAE citizen. It's pretty awesome. So hard to make that argument. Now, the counter argument is, well, hang on, but you've got all this oil money, and so the oil money is going into it. And okay, let's try and then take a look somewhere else. Let's go to Singapore. Singapore has very low taxes. The highest tax bracket in Singapore is 22%. Normally, people shouldn't pay higher than 17 because they have a single imputation system at the level of companies. And on top of that, there's no capital gains tax. Singapore has some of the highest quality of life in the world by far. There's really unquestionably this is the case, and yet the taxes are by global standards quite low. In fact, they're lower than the surrounding countries, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, etc. So, how do you explain that? Hard to figure out. Hong Kong similarly has quite low taxes, quality of life. Okay, they've had some recent political stuff going on, but quality of life has been, relatively pretty good there. And again, you can kind of compare to some of the surrounding countries and see, well, is it really that taxes are responsible? Hard to make that conclusion. For example, you could say, well, taxes are a lot higher in Japan. Japan, great place, lots of good things to appreciate about Japan, but is the quality of life dramatically better in Japan than in Hong Kong? I think tough to make that argument. Well, the taxes are literally like a factor of about 3 higher. So that tells you something. Then let's go over and take a look at comparing within Europe. We have Liechtenstein, super low taxes. I was there, I filmed some video from Liechtenstein this summer. Like the richest country in the world per capita, amazing quality of life, really excellent in terms of what people have, and the taxes are some of the lowest in Europe. So how do you explain that? Andorra, much better than quality of life in Spain, arguably better than it is in some place like France or Portugal, and yet the taxes are much lower. Now, we can argue on things such as climate. I don't think you can include climate in the analysis of quality of life here because clearly that has nothing to do with taxes. And so let's kind of take a look at some other areas to find out. Well, if we go across Southern Europe, we could compare some place like Greece to Cyprus. Cyprus, the quality of life is by many respects better. Certainly the standard of living is a lot higher, and the taxes are much lower than they are in Greece. We could compare some place like Italy to San Marino. San Marino's taxes are lower, quality of life is higher. You could go and you could look across at places like Malta compared to some place like Spain or Portugal. Generally speaking, the quality of life in Malta would be higher, taxes would be lower. So the bottom line is that when we start comparing a bunch of these places, we don't really find very clear analysis. Now, again, lifestyle-wise, if you want to say, well, I enjoy the Mediterranean lifestyle, that's sort of a different thing, right? We're talking about more kind of what are the public services available and what is the ecosystem that it provides you. The ecosystem that's provided in Greece is terrible. The ecosystem that's provided in Portugal is terrible. Top tax bracket in Portugal is 48%. This is, high even by a lot of European standards. I would much rather be in Hungary, which has like 15% tax, or Czech Republic, which, okay, the taxes are a bit higher, but not anywhere near Portugal, and yet the quality of life is pretty good. Let's compare Estonia to Portugal, and so on, right? So as we run across, I think it's really hard to make that argument within Europe, and Europe seems to be the most obvious place. Let's look inside the US. We have different states, right? Quality of life by state, surely you're making this argument that it is higher taxes equal higher quality of life, right? Well, I don't know. I think you could make the argument that the quality of life is pretty high in Texas. There's a lot of people moving there. Quality of life is pretty high in Florida. A lot of people are moving there. Guess what? Those are zero tax states compared to some place like California, New York, etc., which have taxes that are quite high on the state level. We're talking about adding in excess of 10% onto people. So the relative impact is it's about 33% higher, approximately, or 30% higher tax rates if you're living in places like California and New York versus some of these low tax states, Nevada, Texas, Florida. Guess what? Washington State. I lived in Seattle for about a year back a long time ago. Is the quality of life in Washington lower than the quality of life in Portland, Oregon? No, I don't think so. I would argue that in many respects it's better, but there's no state taxes in Washington State. So I think that it's just very, very difficult to make this argument. And you can sort of come up with different ways to try and defend on certain isolated incidents. You can say something like, for example, the argument about the Middle East. They have oil. Okay, yes, they do have oil. But then how do you explain Singapore? How do you explain Liechtenstein? How do you explain the differences between Washington State and California? How do you compare the differences between New York and Florida, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? It's really, really tough to make this argument that there's any strong correlation between taxes and quality of life or quality of services that are provided. Then we can go and we can look on the high-end side. Like I said, places like Africa has some of the highest taxes in the world. South Africa has terrible taxes. Is the quality of life amazing in South Africa? And people want to get out of South Africa like crazy. We have clients regularly from there who are helping to relocate abroad and get set up and form companies in other places, et cetera, because there's lots of problems well beyond the taxes, right? Lots of social problems, et cetera. I mean, Africa in general, you've got that. You can look at some place like Brazil. Brazil is not particularly low tax. Mexico is not particularly low tax. Are the quality of life good there? I mean, some people like to move there as a foreigner who's going down and wants to take advantage of the beach and maybe the freedom or something like that, or, they like Latin women or whatever, perfectly good if you want to go and move there. I mean, I have a very good friend who lives in Sweden and loves it. He moved from some place where he had a better tax treatment. He moved to Sweden because Sweden was what he liked. This is not a statement about what you like. You might like wherever you like. But if we just objectively look at the quality of government services, if we look at what the country offers you in these respects, it's just there isn't a strong correlation between tax and those services. And you'll find that generally speaking, even when you get good services in a place like Mexico, it's usually private, right? Think about healthcare. They have kind of a three-tiered healthcare system in Mexico. And the best is great. Yeah, it's excellent. But it's private. It's not provided by the taxpayer dollars. So hence, what is it that you're really getting for your taxes? You have just tons of corruption, tons of crime, tons of all these issues. And so I think people have these narratives that they get taught that are deeply misguided, and then they end up voting according to these narratives, and that throws things off. So anyway, bottom line conclusion, if you disagree with me, tell me in the comments below. Give me some backed up evidence to point out what it is you think really demonstrates this position. Because as far as I can tell, looking at places from India to, like I said, Brazil to South Africa, etc., comparing them to, Singapore, even like if I compare Malaysia and India, quality of life is higher in Malaysia than it is in India. Taxes are higher in India than they are in Malaysia. Like I can just run through many, many examples of this. And you might say, oh, it's a small country. Okay, well, Malaysia is not really a small country. Even we could look at New Zealand, which was traditionally a fair bit lower tax, compared to Scandinavia. I mean, both would be considered to be high quality of life countries in most metrics, and yet New Zealand has had substantially lower taxes than you would get in some place like Sweden or Denmark. So how do you explain this? It's not something that is an easily defensible position, if defensible at all. So I hope that helps. Give me a kind of like if you like the video, share it with your friends, put the comments down below if you object, and I will see you on the next video.